Please consider becoming a patron of MythVision Podcast. You'll get early access to every video, including this amazing one, and you can ask me personal questions, private message me, anything you'd like. Professor Joel Baden, I have this lingering question because I honestly don't mean this derogatorily, but I'm kind of ignorant on many things. And I know I've got a lot to learn. I came out of the Christian evangelical fundamentalist camp. The Bible interprets the Bible, and it means this most of the time. Where it means this, it all means the same stuff, and it's all talking because it's all the voice of God technically writing through the pen of these men. And I started finding out over the past few years how human the Bible is. And I don't mean that like, well, duh, humans wrote it. No, like human error, humanity, not divine. And I found out that there were probably some contradictions and probably failed prophecies. So I think it's important to start with the basics and work into this. What is prophecy? And tell us maybe some of the humanity errors that have taken place and how they adjusted it.
Yeah, it's funny because like when you use the phrase like failed prophecy, I think we're already dealing with a weird non-biblical notion of prophecy, right? Like we today, I think, often use the word prophecy to think about like telling the future, like the world will end on whatever date. Like that's a prophecy. The Trump prophet, it's like it goes with like belief in like being able to tell me exactly what's going to happen and like did it come true or not. And that's not what prophecy is in the Bible. Virtually all biblical prophecy, virtually all, is an attempt to change the behavior of the people around the prophet, right? And when the future is invoked, it is invoked in terms of, I will bring down my wrath upon you, right? Because you are so bad. With the like underlying idea being, so stop. Like, stop being bad and this won't happen, but like you keep on being so evil and therefore this is what will befall you. Like, so they're not visions of the future for the sake of like, this is the certainty of what will happen. They are, if you don't change your ways, right? Prophets are all about, right? They are speaking truth to power in various ways, but like they're all about trying to engage, whether it's they're speaking to a king or to the populace, right? Change and be different and be better. And like all the prophets who do social justice kinds of work in the 8th century in particular, Amos, Hosea, Micah, Isaiah, right? Like the ones who are like, stop being bad to each other, stop being greedy and evil and otherwise bad, but if you keep on doing it, right, all this bad stuff is going to happen. So, right, what's a failed prophecy in a sense is a successful prophecy, right? Like if I say, right, like change your ways or this terrible thing is going to happen, and you changed your ways, my own prophecy would require that the things that I foretold for the future not come to pass, right? So like, the prophets are hoping that the things that they say won't become true, right? They don't want there to be exile. They want there not to be exile. They don't want punishment. They want you to avoid the punishment. They want you to like, and so when I say, I'm the prophet in this sense. When I say, right, you are destined to go into exile and when you're there, you will like realize the error of your ways, right? What I'm saying is like, if you just realize the error of your ways now, like we can skip the bad part, right? Like we have the time to change it. I mean, so many prophets are speaking directly to their time and place. It's weird to me to think about reading prophecies as being timeless.
Or even way into the
or
distant
even way
future.
into the distant future, because they're so often like explicitly about, like
time.
this time, you king whoever, don't make a treaty with whomever. Like, how do you make that about not what it's about? Like,
Right.
but I know how. And this is the fun part is, in fact, because prophecy was so tied to its particular time and place and circumstances, whether it was, local issues or social justice or imperial threats, Syria, Babylon, Persia, whomever, right? Because they were so responsive to particular moments in time, once that moment had passed, that prophetic text essentially becomes useless, right? Like, if Isaiah says, I'll give you the preeminent example, right?
Okay.
Isaiah says, really, you shouldn't go to war here. And I'll give you a sign that you shouldn't go to war. Like, you should not join this war. And the sign I'm going to give you is that a young woman's going to give birth. Right? Now, within the context of its own prophecy, that prophecy ceases to be relevant as soon as the king decides whether or not to go to the war. Right? Whether or not to fight in the battle. If that sign is in fact about the birth of someone 700 years later, it doesn't do the king very much good in terms of being a sign for the thing Isaiah says it's a sign for.
Right.
Okay. So once that moment has passed, if there's a community that still says these prophecies are important and relevant and part of our culture, like we are followers of that prophet or whatever, but it's what do I do with this like out of date prophecy? Oh, I know. I'll simply say it was about that, but it wasn't really about that. It was about something else too, or it was about something else entirely, or it was, it was meant to look forward in this way.
Right. Can we do a couple?
Jeremiah says 70 years.
Yes.
And somebody hundreds of years later says, how do I make this prophecy about stuff hundreds of years ago relevant to me? Not 70 years, 7 times 70 years. Right? And so Daniel takes up Jeremiah's prophecy and says, nope, like it's not just, or it may have been about that, but I'm reinterpreting it to make it relevant to my circumstances. So when you use the phrase, the Bible interprets itself, right? You meant it in the we can understand what the Bible means by essentially leveling out everything, flattening it so that it's all consistent. Right. Which is a particular hermeneutic of reading. But in fact, the Bible constantly interprets itself, right? That is, prophetic texts in particular are taking up older ideas and older theological positions and saying, that didn't work. How do I adjust it for my own reality? How do I take this thing that didn't come to pass, or maybe that did come to pass and just isn't relevant to me anymore, and make it so that it's about me today, right? The Bible is constantly interpreting itself as prophets are picking up, whether directly on the texts of other prophets, but they do refer to each other. Like Jeremiah refers to Micah, Daniel refers to Jeremiah. There's 3 in a row right there, right? Micah said something and Jeremiah was like, I'm going to refer to Micah's thing, and Daniel says I'm going to refer to Jeremiah's thing. And in every case, it's let me take it. Second Isaiah does it to first Isaiah, right? Take some of those ideas. I'm going to bring them 200 years later, 300 years later. I'm going to make them relevant to me by consciously interpreting them, right? Not by saying that was true, but by being I'm going to take those ideas and those words, and I'm going to say what it really meant was, or what I can turn it to mean is this. And in that way, the Bible is, and the prophets in particular, are constantly building on older ideas, older prophetic thoughts. So one prophet says, we talked about this in a different clip. One prophet says, when the eschaton come, right? When Assyria falls, the eschaton will begin. Right? Isaiah says this. But then Assyria fell, and the eschaton didn't happen. So somebody's got to pick that up, right? You that can't simply just stand there. So second Isaiah comes and says, no. It's in fact, it's not just when Assyria falls, it's when we're restored, right? Like we have to come back. And then it's like, okay, not just when we come back, but when we build the temple, right? And it keeps on getting pushed forward because, right, the eschaton keeps getting pushed forward because it keeps not coming. Like everybody who says that the eschaton is coming has been wrong, right? Because, I mean, here we are today, like, hi, I'm not living in the eschaton. Right? So like no one has been right, which means everybody's prophecy either has to be completely rejected, or since these texts seem to have had some like authority or weight within the communities, they had to be reinterpreted so that they could be brought up to date. Ancient interpreters were totally conscious of doing this, right? The oldest interpretive texts we have, right, like the interpretations of like Habakkuk from the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? They read the prophet Habakkuk, whatever, it's got its like own contextualized thing, and they say, oh, no, this is not actually about that. This is about, we're going to say that this is about us. And this is about our teacher of righteousness, and this is about the teacher of darkness, right? Like, and they're like line by line translating 700-year-old prophecy into being about today. But they're not looking at it and saying, Habakkuk was talking about us. They're looking at it and going, we're going to interpret Habakkuk to be about us, right? We're going to make this text relevant through the interpretive process. They're pretty conscious, I think, of the fact that they're doing that. That like, they're saying this text, we are going to make this text continually relevant by reading it this way, which is different from saying this text was always written to be about us.
I think it tells you a lot about the movement too, about the way they perceive this literature as it's sacred and it's holy, and it has this. It's alive to them, even if it was dated. It speaks to them, and I think that's like we look at that today with Christians. It's not crazy to think that that's something humans do. So yeah,
right. But the difference is, right, and this is something I often wonder about a little bit. So I referred obviously earlier to the Isaiah prophecy of like what became virgin birth, right? And the prophecy of Jesus. So the analogous thing for Christians to have done there would be to say, I know Isaiah wasn't really talking about Jesus, but because Isaiah is part of our scriptures, and in order for it to not simply be like an old fossilized record of something somebody once thought about stuff that's hundreds of years ago and doesn't matter, I need this text to speak to me today. So I'm going to read Isaiah. Granted that it wasn't written to be about Jesus, but I'm going to read it as being about Jesus. Like that's how I'm going to interpret the text into relevance. I don't know whether that happened. I think it probably happened in some pockets, but certainly in other pockets, what happened was, and what you see now is the claim that no. It was written about Jesus. Right? Like Isaiah in the 8th century was looking ahead 800 years, 900 years to Jesus. And it was always about Jesus. Right. And everything else is a misunderstanding. And again, this is the difference between like the interpretation and the thing being interpreted. But prophecy, right? Like the thing I was saying about the Dead Sea Scrolls and Habakkuk, like that's how prophecy works even within the Bible, right? I'm going to make this older thing that was about something else relevant by reframing it. And prophecy does that constantly on itself, right? A constant process of self-interpretation all the way down. I mean, you can sort of trace it, especially as things change. Assyria fell, Babylon fell, Persia fell, right? The Greeks came, the Romans came, right? You can see everybody adjusting as their, every expectation of eschaton ended, as every imperial power that they thought was the last one fell away only for a better one to rise. As they said things like, when we are restored, everything will be better, and then it wasn't. Like, they're constantly playing with all these ideas and like, tweak it a little bit, like reinterpret it a little bit. So the notion of saying, you know what, actually this prophetic text was always about this thing that I think it's about today is like not a particularly biblical way of reading. I don't know, and again, I'm not expert enough to know like whether early Christians, including in the New Testament, were like conscious of the gap between their own interpretations and the thing they're interpreting. But my suspicion is they probably were, because they were Jews, and Jews were very self-conscious about this, about like it meant this and it means this, right? The both and of what a text can mean is enormously Jewish, right? Like suffuses all Jewish texts, right? It's this, and it means this, and it means this, and it means this, and it could mean this, and I think it means this, and I think it means this other thing, and you're both right, and that's fine. Like that's how Jews read. And that's totally incompatible with the like, no. It's always meant this.
See, that's what I was gonna say. All right, so couple things. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9, for example, he says, it is written. Now, mind you, he's not getting paid or something. I can't remember. The Corinthian church is holding money out. And he says, it is written, thou shalt not muzzle an oxen while it threshes, right? And he goes, does God care about animals? No, he's talking about me. That's what Paul literally says, right? So he like literally, and I've heard this is something in the rabbinic tradition where they like, this is something that's mentioned, there's a debate, like, does God actually care about animals or whatnot? But he says, no, it's not talking about animals in the actual law. He reinterprets it and says, this is a prophecy about me. And he believes that from my mother's womb, just like he is Jeremiah, I believe it is, or it's Jeremiah. And he thinks he's like this new prophet, reinterpreting things. But something interesting, because you big on the Pentateuch, I wanted to ask you, in Deuteronomy 28, there seems to be this like doom and gloom in your latter days. It's like this prophecy that's talking about in the end of days, you will be like, cast off into the lands, into the nations, you'll be scattered.
It's not in the end of days. It's not eschatological at all. Right? Deuteronomy 28 is entirely like historical, right? Deuteronomy 28 is people looking around being like,
when is this happening, if you don't mind me asking, historically?
I mean, Deuteronomy 28 is in the Assyrian period. So
Okay.
They're looking at, the north has been destroyed, and they're looking at impending imperial disaster from the Assyrians. And so it's not at all eschatological. It's entirely about like the threat of your success and ability to stay in this land is contingent on obeying these laws. Otherwise, here's this whole list of terrible stuff that's going to happen to you. And some of it is like, feels like, like end of days ish. The skies will be iron, like in the earth. But like that's just these are expressions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And wild beasts, right? And that, but
you will eat the fruit of your own womb, things like that.
Yeah. But that's the thing. Like that happened, right? Like we have in Lamentations, right, from the poems about the conquest of the Babylonians, and parents having to eat their children, right? Like this is not like it's maybe like heightened language, but all the concepts are basically like, it's just describing the fall of a civilization. In any case, that's not eschatological at all. They're simply looking at like what happens when an empire comes and sweeps you essentially out of existence.
Interesting. Yeah, I think this is fascinating. So then in prophecy, if we will, the lost tribes concept, Israel gets destroyed by Assyria. They get taken in captivity. I interviewed Dr. Zvi Benit recently. He's a really interesting guy who wrote a book on the lost tribes, like all the way through history, like how it was interpreted and understood. There were literally people out floating on boats looking for lost lands with people, and the Native Americans with the Mormons, it just never ended. But there's a group that thinks that the first century is where this is actually this theological prophetic scheme, if you will, because they haven't been found yet, is being used by Paul to apply to these ethne and in a literal sense. Using that prophecy idea, that's a hole in that prophecy that the northern kingdom came back, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong. Like it seems like when they got taken by Assyria, some of the prophets sound like they're like hoping that they're going to come back.
Yeah, I don't know that I see a ton of that, honestly. Like, we have prophets who prophesied to the north when it still existed. Essentially, right before, in the 8th century, as it was failing or about to fail, being like, doing the same thing, right? Like, y'all are going to go under, right? Terrible things are going to happen. I don't think, but they don't tend to imagine exile, actually. You don't find a lot of exilic references in 8th century northern facing prophecy. They're mostly just like, it's mostly social justice kinds of issues. Once they're gone, once the northern kingdom is destroyed, all the prophets are naturally focused then on the south, saying many of the same things. I don't see a lot of anybody caring much about what happened to those people from the north. to my mind, and I may be missing it, but to my mind, the whole 10 lost tribes thing is a completely non-biblical idea, right? Like, I don't think there's any idea in the Bible of like getting those folks back. Once they're gone, the folks in Judah are like, we'll take over their territory. Part of the issue is, and this is like a slightly separate conversation, part of the issue is the notion of like the one Israel, of which there are 10 lost tribes, then like the ones who weren't lost, is like based on the idea of one unified Israel that needs to come back together. I don't think almost anybody in Israel had any notion of that, right? Like the people in Judah weren't like, oh no, our 10 lost tribes of us, right? They were like, we hate those guys. We've been fighting wars against them for years. Like that is a separate kingdom, right? Yeah, they got wiped out. Like they're gone. We can take over that territory now, maybe, or not. But like we're gonna like that happens, right? Like the myth of 10 lost tribes or like the need to reunify Israel is fundamentally based on a sort of a biblical mythology that I don't think had any reality for the people living in that time and place. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think that kind of is why Judah reconstituted Israel when the northern kingdom is no longer there.
Yeah, they were like, great, it's us then. Like we are the only ones left who are the descendants, consider ourselves descendants of, whomever.
To the point where they say no to the people in the land when they come back. They're like, no.
No, it's not right. They were so uninterested in the northern kingdom. Like, yeah, Israel became defined in the later books, obviously, as the people who got exiled by the Babylonians and then returned from Babylon. So if you stayed in Babylon, you weren't a real Israelite. And if you had been in the land, if you were in the land and didn't get exiled and just been there the whole time, you weren't a real Israelite. Because Israel is defined by the experience of having gone through the exile and then returning.
Wow.
Right? Which is not so different from Israel being defined, thousands of years earlier, in fake terms, by the experience of having been part of the Exodus, right? When we look at the story of the Pentateuch, right, we see like this way the Pentateuch tells the story. Everybody who identifies as Israel left and came back, right? But we know that in reality, plenty of people who we would identify as Israelites never left, right? They were just the Canaanites who moved into the hill country and stayed there, right? But they collectively were like, nope, our story is you are an Israelite because you went to Egypt from here and you returned to Egypt, you returned to Canaan from Egypt. And, they replicated the same thing generations later. You're only a real Israelite if you left and you came back. No one cares about the North. Like, the North, they couldn't possibly have experienced it. They couldn't possibly be defined as the real Israel. That was hundreds of years ago. I mean, that's ages in that time period. And also, again, I think like to one degree or another, if you were in Judah and you watched Israel get wiped out by the Assyrians, it would not have been substantially different from being in Judah and watching like Moab get wiped out by the Babylonians. It'd be like, sucks for you, dude. Like, but, we ache for the return of our Moabite brethren. That's not a thing. And I like Israel. Yeah.
So then two things, if you don't mind. The 12 tribes of Israel concept, that gets used later. Is that just like a myth based on the United Monarchy concept, and it just continues on? Yeah.
So my take is that the whole notion of the 12 tribes with the like genetic, like genealogical, like tie back through the patriarchs is entirely, to my mind, is not entirely, at least largely United Monarchy propaganda. And I think probably United Monarchy, that is to say, when David and Solomon take over from Judah, take over the northern kingdom and do the fictive kinship thing, right? They say like, no, we're not two separate people. We've always been the same people. We all go back to the same ancestors. We're adopting, you've got Jacob, we've got Abraham and Isaac, and like, we're all part of the same family. And then stories get told and built around that. But I don't think, so yeah, I think that's more propaganda than certainly reality.
Right.
Right. It's not the fact that all the 12 tribes came from one. It's that all the 12 tribes became one.
And what do you think, if you don't mind me, last question,
Yeah.
with 5 minutes left on the clock. What do you think, this is not in your wheelhouse, but I love to just ask scholars, when Jesus comes on the scene and there's these quotes put in the mouth of him, whether he said this or not, in the Gospels, that you, 12, you will judge the 12 tribes, or this idea that the 12 disciples will judge Israel. And he mentions 12 tribes a lot, or let me not say a lot, but they're mentioned throughout the New Testament as though it will be a reality, right? That there's going to be 12 tribes. If Judah becomes the reconstitution of Israel and they're like kind of like, to the north, that 12 tribe thing, like for example, there's a rabbi, Akiva, he thought they're lost. He literally says this in the 2nd century, like in one of his writings, he's like, they're not coming back, quit looking. But Josephus can't let go of it. And he's like, oh, there's 2 tribes here, there's 10 out here east of the Euphrates. Different Jews with different ideas that are going on. The New Testament has this idea that you will judge the 12 tribes, or this something like that. Is that just building off of the tradition, and they're looking at the Old Testament narratives and they're reading it like, this has got to be true for us today, and it's really a united monarchy first in its own original context, if it's even that, you know what I mean? Do you think that's what's going on?
I mean, I think we have to remember, whatever the case, that no one in the New Testament or in that period is thinking historically, right? Like, their understandings of all biblical things are based on a book, right? It's all literary. So,
because there's no 10 northern tribes floating around, and
right, but to use the phrase 12 tribes is not necessarily so different from just saying Israel, right? It's like, it's, to me, it's not particularly revealing. Again, it's not my area, so maybe it's more revealing than I think it is. But it just seems to me like it's, again, I don't think there's any reason to think that somebody saying 12 tribes in the 1st century in that kind of context is going to be thinking about like, well, where the other 10 tribes may be. We have to like get the whole tribal idea like into its correct like framework, right? It's conceptual. Really, there are tribes, but for the most part in Israel's history, there's just 2 things. There's a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And, our idea of them as being one people is fake, right? Like, that's the idea of them being one is the weird thing that happened for like less than 100 years of its history. And otherwise, right, like they're different peoples altogether, right? And we can look at, it's like Czechoslovakia, right? Like there's all kinds of modern, examples of that, like nations that were weirdly created, but like never really worked because they didn't really go together.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.